Library of Ruina is the game I've gotten far and away the most requests to cover for this series of worst difficulty spikes, so I'm finally doing just that. Usually these videos I have some sort of story about how the boss or level gave me hell as a kid or as a teenager, but this time around that isn't the case because I've never played this game before, and I frankly knew next to nothing about it other than 2 millisongs, and I know the difficulty spike is supposedly vertical. I also know a character named Olga because I have a friend on Discord who's obsessed with tired alcoholic women, but that's another story for another day. Basically, I'm going in 99% blind, so bear with me. This won't follow quite the same structure as the previous worst difficulty spike videos, as I haven't even beaten the game as of scripting this video. And if I get any terminology or whatever wrong, bear with me, or don't, I don't give a shit. Anyways, I've been told time and time again about the horror stories that are the Queen of Hatred, and you know what? Sounds fun. So, that's enough rambling, that's enough stalling. Let's dive on in, shall we? Of course, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently this time around in terms of structure. Normally, I give a lead-up that's a brief 30 to 90 seconds touching upon whatever notable levels or boss fights take place and can be a challenge, maybe, and then talk about the boss in question. But because this was a blind run with a handful of stumbling points, I figured I'd kind of just go over the interesting parts of my journey as it went, talk about whatever was interesting, and whatever else. If you only really want to see the Queen of Hatred stuff, then just go to her chapter. It's probably on your time bar, and you can always find the timestamp in the description. Anyways, the journey begins with you meeting with Angela, who's less than thrilled with Roland after he backwards long jumped his way into the library without any permission. She promptly ends up blowing his limbs off, which kinda sets the tone for this game if we're being honest. Many cutscenes later, we're given our tutorial battle where we murder a trio of homeless guys. When killed, they'll turn into books, which you can burn, which gives you character pages and skill pages. Character pages are sorta like Final Fantasy job classes, and going forth will be referred to as such because I'm not going to remember character pages. And skill pages are more like the attacks you get from those job classes. However, you can pretty easily mix and match your attacks. Your character page doesn't really affect the attacks you can do, however, they will impact your overall stats and passive abilities, especially early on in the game. Really though, homeless people aren't cream of the crop fighters, so pick whatever, they're going to be outclassed by the next battle anyways. Our next notable battle takes place against the young office rookie, also known as Finn. He's very easy, but he'll actually block your attacks, and if his stats weren't so low, you might have needed to actually pay attention to what he does. While you won't need to worry about your dice rolls too terribly much early on in the game, you will need to keep track of however much light you have, as that's more or less your MP that you use to utilize different attacks. It's not a perfect one-to-one, but that's the best comparison I can give off the top of my head. You can still kind of use whatever random skills you want early on and probably win at this point though, but he will take a bit more effort than the 3 homeless people did. Of course, things get a lot more interesting after this fight in particular because we unlock a special book, the Book of Bloodbath. These are known as realization bosses if I'm not mistaken. They follow very different rules from the standard battles in Library of Ruina, and in many cases can be seen as something like puzzles. And this is also the first guy that royally kicked my ass. I will admit, it's 100% my fault, but he still kicked my ass nonetheless. One thing you need to learn is, well, preferable to learn now instead of later, is mousing over the enemy's dice to see what attacks they are going to do and who they're going to target, whether it's a big hit, a multi-hitter, or something else entirely. Sometimes these attacks are telegraphed ahead of time, but other times, just expect big damage. What I did not realize until much later in the game is that you do not want to try and counter multi-hit moves with your own multi-hit moves, as it can become an RNG shitfest really quickly. Instead, what I found works best is to try to use a card with a larger single attack value like Dirty Blow to more or less parry the attacks or utilize defensive cards like Struggle. Normally, I would also say you can just save this fight for later, but, well, most realization bosses you don't have to fight immediately, but in this case, the first one, you kind of do need to complete it here and now to unlock your party members, and you're gonna need to get it done sooner or later anyways. And you're gonna need those party members because our next battle pits us against Yun and Eri. This is your first time you battle multiple waves of enemies. In this case, 2 goons will be battled in the first wave, Then wave 2 you'll battle Yuna and Eri. Thankfully, with 2 party members in tow, the goons are a complete and total joke. Oddly enough, the game says you have 3 floors available, which would mean you can have extra reinforcements in case you die, but you haven't unlocked any additional floors, and by extension haven't unlocked any extra party members to make use of that yet, so that's a lie. Anyways, Yun and Eri can be a fair bit tougher than the other fights up to this point, because while the rats were a 3v1, they were trash mobs, while these two can put up something of a fight. With a backup team member, this isn't that difficult, and for beating them, you unlock their books, which can lead to some significant power boosts, especially in the job class department. Yes, I now know it's called character sheets and everything, and it's not actually called job classes. Look, I grew up with Final Fantasy V and Bravely Default, just deal with it. At this point, Roland ends up asking Angela what the hell's the deal with this library, as it's more or less become a flame that attracts moths. Supposedly, they choose to come here of their own free will and fight. Yeah, that logic may or may not start falling apart under some scrutiny further on in the game, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. To be honest though, this whole bit reminds me of that Junji Ito comic with the holes in the cliffside. That's about all I got on that matter. Far more importantly, however, we unlock a new floor of the library, and what does that mean? Well, it means we have a new main character to add to the cast. This is Malkuth. I like Malkuth. Overall, I'd say she's actually probably my favorite character out of everything I've played up to this point in the game, and also far past this point in the game, but I'm not here to give you a character study lecture. Mechanically, her main benefit is providing the player with a second floor, which means should Roland's team wipe in battle, and another floor is available to use, Malkuth can come in and continue the battle, and in most cases the enemies will retain the damage they took and remain dead if they were killed. I say most cases because I do know of one very notable example where the boss is able to revive their minions to a certain HP level in between rounds, but it's not that common. And there's also plenty of religious symbolism here, as Malkuth is named after one of the 10 Sephiroth, and if you actually look at the structure of the library, it's set up like the Tree of Life in the Jewish Kabbalah, so yeah, it all lines up pretty well there. I make no promises for perfect accuracy on a lot of this stuff here because, for one, I'm not Jewish, I'm a Christian. For two, I'm not a theological professor, I'm a supposedly internet funny man. All I can promise is we will be busting out the Bible at least once this video. But upon defeating Yun and Eri, and possibly defeating the Bloodbath as well, I don't know if he's a prerequisite or not, the library as a whole will rank up. What does all this mean? Well, basic ass game progression. Okay, technically it means we'll be able to do more in the library and we'll see tougher challenges, but really it's just kind of standard game progression, and we don't see any major significant changes until we get to like Urban Plague, I believe. Anyways, we also unlock another floor around this point that gets us a dude named Yasad, and I didn't record his introduction because, whoops, but essentially he's a neat freak and his color scheme is purple. And there was Malkuth's first realization fight, which was so easy I didn't even think to record it. Again, whoops. And we have a battle against some generic enemies called the Backstreet Butchers, blah 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 blah. A lot of stuff you don't care about. They're fairly easy fights, but they have a lot of skills focused around bleed and restoring health when dealing damage. It's definitely worth beating the crap out of them because their skills are actually pretty good this early on, and as you'll very soon see, there's no need to feel any sort of sympathy for these butchers. And that's because our next major fight pits us against their bosses, Pierre and Jack, and it takes all of 20 seconds, if even that, to piece together. The chefs are chopping up and cooking people. Alive, in many instances. Yeah, we have some cannibals to exterminate. Apparently the cruelty adds to the flavor, which reminds me of those adrenochrome posts on the internet everywhere, like 10 years ago almost. Anyways, just remember the difference between a conspiracy theory and a proven fact. It's usually a few months or 8,792 Ayatollahs. Anyways, these cannibals aren't too difficult to beat, but they do specialize in bleeding and have some HP recovery, with Jack in particular regenerating 2 HP every turn, adding to his survivability on top of both of them having die that range from 2 to 5, which makes things tougher, and soon enough you're going to really want to start improving your roll ranges, which took me entirely too long to figure out, but either way, with enough punishment, these sick asshats will go down. The next realization boss is going to be against the Forsaken Murderer, and it's actually pretty notable because he's a rat bastard. Basically, when he has one light, he's going to play defensive, and that's your cue to attack. Then when his light gauge is at 2, he's going to go for his annoying as hell triple strike. There's 2 answers that work here. Well, technically 3. Either use strong defensive cards to block his triple attack. Light defense works pretty well all in all. Or go all out with higher damage cards to simply overpower him. Or, bash your head against the wall till it works. Rampage can work, but it's risky, so of course that's exactly what I went with. We learn more about Yasad and how he's a neat freak, and we learn that the librarians here used to help people in their previous life. Most of them weren't fighters and instead are only so capable in combat due to them obtaining power from the knowledge within the books. Basically, they're more or less doing the same shit Roland does of working out at the library, essentially. Shortly after this, we unlock Hod. Overall, I like her character as well. The urban myth stretch of the game seems to be less about going through the main story bits and more about unlocking new characters, playing the realization battles, and catching your new party members up to Roland. And that also means you're having more resources to juggle at this point in the game. So it's probably good they don't really add a bunch of extra mechanics just yet. More fights happen, and one of them leads to us killing a dude named Mars, and this girl Lulu actually survives the battle and wants revenge against us with a line that I understand, but it does still sound kind of stupid. It's, "I'll go alone. I've got friends that'll come with me." I get what she means, but this feels like one of those minor mistranslation moments you get in games that were originally made in a foreign language, which, maybe it is, I don't know. Either way, yeah, we're kind of the jackass here. This fight can be a massive step up in challenge since Lulu has a tendency to light you on fire, and from my personal experience, she has some of the best attacking skills in the early game, both on the giving and receiving end. As we shall see, the ability to light people on fire is very useful going forward, and I will be abusing it. That being said, I need to talk about one of my personal biggest issues with this game, and that's the story. Not so much the character episodes and the realizations, but the main plot. I'm not saying it's bad by any means, but unfortunately, much of the main plot is structured in the same manner as the anime Darker Than Black, Season 1 in particular. Now, what the hell do I mean by all of this? Well, a large amount of that anime doesn't focus on the main characters. They'll get, on average, 25% of the screen time per episode, while the main focus is one or another side character, or often an antagonist of the arc, where you see them do something, learn their backstory, and more often than not, they're going to be dead by their second episode. Rinse and repeat until the end. Now, that is a gross generalization, and thankfully, unlike Darker Than Black, we do have more stuff that actually happens in Library of Ruina, but up until reaching Urban Legend, and really up until Urban Plague, there's not much point getting super interested in these characters, as they're going to be dead and used as nothing more than job class fodder roughly 10 to 30 minutes after they've been introduced. Thankfully, unlike Darker Than Black, this is only an issue in the earlier stretches of the game, and it doesn't last until the final arc, so it's not quite a lost cause. Actually, I guess while I'm on this tangent, I actually think Season 2 story is considerably better, as each arc is roughly 3 episodes instead of just 2, and the focus is placed more often on the main cast instead of on side characters that are getting lined up to just get whacked. What was I talking about again? Anyways, we kill Lulu, and Roland admits he does feel for her, though he's mostly grown numb to these sorts of tragedies. Unfortunately for you, the player, you're going to want to keep killing Mars and Lulu because they have some of the best skill cards in the early game, and in Mars's case, comes with the first job class that gets double dice, and you really, 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 really want that. Also, beating Lulu is the last thing in Urban Myth, but you will likely see you have to reach grade 8 in order to advance to Urban Legend, and to do that we need to take on some more realization bosses. Now, our next realization boss is for Hod, and this pits us against a creature known as Today's Shylock, who has so little health it's entirely possible you just unga bunga and win. But going a bit more into detail here, the fight has some level of real-time events thrown in, as the power of his attacks and defense seem to be affected by what face the second body is behind, though to be perfectly honest with you, I can't tell if the movements have a pattern or if it's completely random. All I can say is that between this and Invasive Diablos and Monster Hunter Stories 3, if I had a nickel for every time a turn-based RPG had a real-time element thrown into a random boss fight, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. This was another fight I won on my first try without figuring much out, and I only realized it had a gimmick thanks to Discord. Speaking with Hod has some interesting story reveals here as she points out how each person who dies here becomes a book and their lives could be considered works of literature. Unfortunately, most of these works are just tragedies, and one or two of them might be a comedy. Roland, being Roland, chooses to respond with his signature line of "this is this and that is that." After the scene ends, we rank up and become Urban Legends, which means more progression stuff. Hooray. And it also means we learn more about Angela's main goal being freedom. Surprisingly, straightforward all things considered. Oh, right, we also unlock an alcoholic. Now, getting into Urban Legend, we have more plot stuff, but more importantly, we unlock our first Stage 2 realization boss, in this case for Roland against the Heart of Aspiration. This fight looks intimidating, but honestly, it's quite easy. Just don't waste your time against the Heart until its light gauge is maxed out, as it just spams defensive skills that do no damage to you until it's maxed out. Take out the lungs as fast as you can to reduce the chip damage that goes on in the fight. That being said, once the Heart fills the light gauge, it can go for some powerful attacks, but hopefully he shouldn't have enough time to really win. Gotta be honest, while some of these fights look funky, every single realization boss from Shylock up until Queen of Hatred was a first try win for me, with only a single exception that took me a second attempt, which I'll talk about when I get to it. Library of Ruina is not an easy game, but this stretch in particular is surprisingly lax even with how underpowered I was for a good long while. And it's kind of the point where I don't have as much to say about some of this stuff, at least in the gameplay sense. I'll have more to say about in the story, so I don't know. Things may get a bit disjointed here, bear with me on that. Beating the Heart of Aspiration leads to a scene where Roland gathers the other librarians, and in case it wasn't abundantly clear already, they despise Angela, especially Malkuth and Yasad. Hod and Netzach are far from fans either, but more importantly, this unlocks the next stage of realizations as well as increasing the emotion threshold level, which I guess is kinda sorta like the tension gauge in Xenoblade Chronicles, but that's not the best comparison out there. Either way, essentially that means the Heart of Aspiration is kind of a linchpin boss that you need to take down to progress, because it's stopping you from ranking up the other characters, and you need to rank them up in order to, well, progress through the whole game. With us being Urban Legends, we now have to deal with higher level offices like ZYS, which is of course more interesting seeming characters that will all be dead and gone before this arc ends. Yeah, we're not out of that woods yet, unfortunately. Also, more unfortunately, this fight led to my death and my first real loss against a story battle. And that's another gripe I have with this game. See, I ran out of the correct books to use as invitations to send, which meant I had to go back to previous levels to, well, get more of them. The obvious answer is to just have extra copies, but you also need to burn the books in order to unlock skill cards and job classes, which you have to keep upgrading or you'll just be setting yourself up for pain. So if you run out, then your ass is looking through what you have and going all the way back to some random ass early game fight and replaying from there up until you get every invitation needed to keep going. And keep in mind, these books are not guaranteed drops, so you may have to replay the levels a second or third time, and death becomes more likely because the enemies are starting to have much higher health on average, and all of them now have rolls ranging from 2 to 5 instead of 1 to 4, which can make a big difference. I did continue to play legitimately for now, but once I had the same issue happen later in the game, I just started cheating in 99 books for everything I've unlocked so far. You could call it cheap, but I call it reducing the run back, because at a certain point, I don't really want to keep replaying those levels over and over again. Our next realization fight is the Fragment of the Universe, which is a cool name for a boss and a cool looking boss in general, but the fight's a complete joke. He doesn't do a ton of damage on his own, and his main gimmick is to give you Eldritch Knowledge, aka putting a card in your hand that halves your stagger defense when it's in your hand. But you know you can just use the card to free up the slot and get rid of the weakness, and it gives you 8 shield points, which means you're going to block most attacks, and it gets rid of the debuff in the process, so GG's, dumbass. After that, we get a scene with Netza, who I probably pronounced his name wrong, where he gets wasted and name drops Lobotomy Corporation, which is the prequel to this game that some people swear by, but I gotta be honest, I don't really see the appeal. Angela looks nice with her long hair, sure, but the game looks like Fallout Shelter and SCP Foundation hate fucked and spawned it 9 months later, where it was promptly abandoned somewhere in South Korea. I've got no desire to play that game if I'm being honest, and I don't think I ever will touch it. Oh gee, more scenes with these characters. I sure do hope they have long and interesting lives with relationships we get to learn up. Oh, never mind, 2 of them are already dead. Real talk though, start swapping out everyone's job classes over to stuff like Zwei Fixers because they have higher stats and other stuff on average can be useful. Their dice rolls are also going to be between 2 and 5 instead of 1 to 4. More interestingly is the other story they talk about here where we learn about the catastrophic distortion with a monster known as the Pianist which killed 80% of a fucking city and more or less turned them into music notes. Which, grim, but hey, I'll give it credit, that's a more creative apocalypse than most. Heading off to our next realization boss, we're back with Malkuth fighting a giant teddy bear. He always rolls a 10 and tries to do high stun damage, but his scary move is his hug, which will stagger you 100% of the time if it hits. But it also does a flat 30 damage. Unless you're staggered, then it does 60, effectively being a one-shot at this point. Somehow I won this fight on my first attempt thanks to some burn cheese and punching the crap out of him, but honestly, I probably shouldn't have won this one here. I don't know. I think the main gimmick is probably, or maybe not the main gimmick, but the main way to beat the fight is probably just stack up damage over time effects and have him die from that. The scene afterwards has us learn more about Malkuth's previous life. After sacrificing her human body, she sought to help people. Unfortunately, it was for Lobotomy Corporation, and half of those fuckers treat employees like Sims with how they kill them, and the other half just get killed because Thomas the Tank Engine was busy, so Diesel's evil ass came to town instead. Otherwise, all of these second stage realization cutscenes are more or less going to be with the librarians revealing about the deal they ultimately made with Angela, which led to them being in the library now, and it's kind of going to be drip fed to you throughout the course of, well, this chapter, so to speak. Though this cutscene seems like Angela wants Malkuth to move on and start living her life, just like Roland. We're mostly in the dark on details here though, so it remains to be seen. Next up, we fight Walter, who's pretty easy, but he's the first opponent to utilize double dice, which can be dangerous. However, he's also one of the other job classes that gives double dice when you burn his page, so it's definitely worth getting a few of these. I know I'm yada-yadaing a lot of stuff here, but I'm sorry, this was kind of the point I was starting to zone out a bit, at least with the main storyline plot, because it really does just end up being a lot of, the library's mysterious, let's go there. Welcome to the library, guests. Angela, you're not a human. And we fight, and then they die, rinse and repeat. It gets kind of monotonous after a bit. Thankfully, it does get better once we make it into the next major story segment thing. I don't fucking know. And then there's the fight with the all-around helpers, and I'm not gonna lie, I have nothing to say about this fight. It's so easy, it's kind of boring, especially compared to the first realization fight each library had. I don't know, this one is just nothing. The scene after is interesting at least. We learn more about the actions of Lobotomy Corporation, which would probably be far more exciting if I had any desire to play that game. What's more interesting to me is the point where Roland gets sick of Yasat's grandstanding and tears into his ass, and yes, people use these dangerous products because they had no other choice to do so, or, die. Why does this seem kind of thematic and relevant to the game's story? I wonder. Finally though, something interesting happens as we get the Molars, which are Olga, Mika, and Rain. And I say that it's interesting because these characters actually come back in Limbus Company. I haven't played Limbus Company, but I have a friend that's addicted to it, so I actually recognize these characters, especially Olga because, again, tired, alcoholic, grown woman. What's less cool is my recording failing and having to re-record this segment 3 times. Sometimes I really hate OBS. They're on the warp train, which is supposed to allow people to get anywhere they want in just 10 seconds, and we also see 2 other random NPCs that oddly enough are named. Sure, they won't be connected to a creepy and depressing moment in the game later on. The warp train, however, ultimately experiences some major technical difficulties, and now, instead of 10 seconds, they're stuck there for over 16 hours and counting. Remember this, it'll be very important later on. But it won't be important now because Olga will use an invitation to get her, Rain, and Mika the fuck out of there. Anyways, the Molars are connected to Mio, who Angela has some history with, and something tells me that'll be important to the plot later on. And we've got our boss fight with the Molar office. Honestly, this fight can be pretty tough as each of them does respectable damage, and Olga is another boss that has double dice. However, they're surprisingly susceptible to being burst down, and so really if you just target one of them at a time, it works well, and they each have unique lines when the other 2 die. Almost like they care about each other or something. I'm not really sure how, as I haven't beaten the game as of recording this script or played Limbus Company, but some way or another they end up returning to their original forms instead of being stuck as books, so I don't know, I guess we ain't playing the Seal of Orichalcos, or maybe we did, and then at the end of the game the Great Leviathan gets killed. There's your Yu-Gi-Oh reference for the video. But first, before we can get back to the interesting stuff, we have to fight some Korean gangsters. This gets really annoying because Gyeongmi is able to attack you 4 times with a single skill card, likely taking out anyone that's staggered or at half health. I don't have a lot to say on this fight other than fuck Gyeongmi in particular, and I named the video file for this boss fight Quad Strike Bullshit. So, there you go. The Red Shoes are completely unremarkable opponents. What's more interesting is Hod's story scene where she admits she's not able to wholeheartedly hate Angela like the others because she feels responsible for the deaths of everyone, so she at least has some sympathy for Angela. We also learn about a deal Angela made with the librarians back during the events of Lobotomy Corporation, and it seems that Hod intended to die as part of the plan's completion, but things didn't go as intended. Child of the Galaxy had a gimmick where I believe his mooks were invincible. I don't know, not much to say on that fight. We have a drunken conversation between Roland and Netzach, where, well, it's more about the fallout caused by the pianist, as well as showing more of the deal the librarian struck with Angela. They really are making sure you only get bits and pieces of the story, but we're finally able to reach Urban Plague. Now, if it sounded like I was pretty sour towards Urban Legend, that's kinda cause I am, though not so much the writing's fault. It's not bad. The big issue was I actually had some weird file corruption happen, so I had to replay a large amount of that. And that's why you can see me mashing through quite a few of these cutscenes because, well, I've already seen them. And realistically speaking, a majority of y'all either skipped ahead to the Queen of Hatred segment or you're just listening to this in the background. Oh, and if you're one of those people who's asleep and has this playing while you're asleep, wake the fuck up! Finally, we're at the point where stuff starts happening again. Kind of. There's still a bunch of yada yada fights to get through, but we're finally reaching the point where we can unlock the Queen of Hatred, as well as a boss fight that I think is honestly worse. But we also get more of a look at Roland's life, where he starts opening up with Angela, who is starting to call him by his name, about his life beforehand. This is also the point where we learn Roland was married and very much loved his wife, but for one reason or another she met an untimely end that put him in a downward spiral for a long while. I'll give you 3 guesses what the cause of her death was. Far more importantly, we can finally transfer passive abilities. This is a non-negotiable essential skill set, and I'm going to tell you now, it's time to start getting everyone double dice rolls or some sort of build that can work with only a single dice, because you're going to need it. So, first up is Urban Plague is less linear, as you now have 4 story branches you can tackle in any order. Personally, I chose to go left to right, and that seems to be the correct way to do it, because difficulty-wise it's a better way to do it. But, ultimately, none of the first set of fights did anything in particular to stand out to me, likely because I was recording this at 2:30 in the morning. Don't do that, by the way, it's bad for your health and you start to get bitter and tired. I will say though, Alpha, Beta, and Gamma have some amazing skills to pick up for this point in the game, especially if you like bleed builds. Also, I don't have too much to say about the Yakuza fight or the weird animal mask guys with their leader dressed like a hooker. They give more good job classes, but they're just kinda some guys to kill. So instead I want to take a second to talk about the battle music. Now, specific bosses and realization bosses have their own soundtracks, but for most battles there's basically multiple versions of a battle theme that alter depending on the emotion level, growing more intense as the fight becomes more dire, both for you and your enemies. It's a cool idea, and the only direct comparison I can make is Phantasy Star 3, but it's way better here because it doesn't make my ears bleed and there's different battle themes for each floor, so it's pretty neat. Funny enough, after I beat Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, I had a scene where Roland is talking about how he's doing all the fighting and bleeding for Angela. Which is ironic because after beating the animal masked hooker lady, Angela actually is revealed to have been injured in the battle. Hod's realization boss is once again easy, but this one has a gimmick where the mooks have to die to leave the nest vulnerable at least. Hod also talks about her counseling program for employees of Lobotomy Corporation since they had the life expectancy of a red shirt in a sci-fi story. I wish I could tell you something about the Porcubus, but he just sort of exploded from a single hit due to a glitch. Be careful when messing around with the Steam Workshop. Oh, and Netzach's talking about he doesn't drink on the anniversary of the day he died. Then there was this fight with Philip. Philip is a rat bastard, so I chose to save his fight for later. Trust me, we'll talk about this jackass when we get to him. On to the Fairy Queen, we have an actual realization boss that took me 2 attempts to beat. This fight was honestly pretty neat. For some reason, my brain kept thinking she was called Insect Queen, so I had this entire joke about Yu-Gi-Oh! And Joey Wheeler having it be a terrible card in his deck. But anyways, that's not important. One thing is, she tries to keep her minions alive and healthy. In fact, I don't even know if it's possible to kill them in Phase 1. She's that dedicated to their safety, and they regenerate every turn. However, when she's backed into a corner, she'll devour her minions, restoring up to 90 HP, as well as buffing all her stats to absurd levels. It kinda seems like you want to avoid this at all costs, but it ultimately turns the fight into a burn phase, more than anything else. And really, I don't know how I beat this fight on my second attempt, but I won via mutually assured destruction, which is pretty funny. I do really like the scene with Malkuth, how she admits she's trying her best to do what she can with her new life and learn from her past mistakes while not being completely trapped in the past, and she has a bit where she seems to hope Angela is changing for the better, albeit she's not so sure about it. And I guess we'll have to see as the game progresses. But all of that is peanuts compared to the real reward as we unlock the floor of natural sciences, meaning finally another party member. Additionally, we unlock Tipperith, the obligatory sassy lost child of the team. Actually, in this case, she straight up died as a kid, was reborn as a robot, died again before being brought back as a librarian in an older body, but she still looks like a teenager at most. Though perhaps due to her younger age or some other reason, she doesn't hold the same hatred for Angela that the other librarians have held so far, albeit she's still not a huge fan, but she's a middle layer librarian, which means she comes with a few perks while also having a realization available right out of the gate. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for pain. We finally unlocked the Queen of Hatred after quite a while of game, and pro tip guys, make sure you've actually outfitted your librarians and don't send them in without job classes. That's just asking for things to go horribly wrong. So, as for preparation, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. Your regular attacking cards and your passive abilities. I personally recommend making sure everyone is equipped with a job class that gets a speed dice by default if you can, but if not, you can always transfer one over, however it will take up a fair bit of your passive ability slots. Whatever works best for you, it's entirely up to you. Otherwise, there's plenty of passive skills you can get that do an amazing job once you rank up to Urban Nightmare and your slots increase from 6 to 8. And yeah, that makes things a lot easier. But I'm not doing that because, I don't know, I'm a masochist, I guess. So for me, I found myself liking extra survivability and Flaming Bat, and Razor Strike for building up damage over time against the boss. Now, there is a very powerful strategy I know about that makes the Queen of Hatred much easier, which is called not fighting her as soon as you unlock her. However, I'm stubborn, so I'm choosing to utilize what I have here and now. And in this case, a solid defense card can be nice. Cards that stack up burn or bleed can be very helpful. And one thing I didn't realize until later is that it's really good to have some 3-point cards that do maybe one, at most 2 big hits, for a reason I'll talk about a bit later when we get into the fight. Multi-hitters can be good, but they shouldn't be your only options for fighting her. Though, there is a skill you can get called Singular Strike that combines all of the attacks into one big hit for burst damage. However, it's behind Urban Nightmare rank, so we can't make use of this. Oh well. I will also say pack 1 or 2 decent 0-point cards with bonus effects like Loosen Up or Handle Request to give you extra passive buffs or burn the enemy some. They won't be doing big damage, but they're still nice to have as a way to keep damage and status effects on the board without expending light unnecessarily. Otherwise, I personally like Lulu's fire-based attacks because, well, you're able to burn enemies to stack damage, and it's very nice, and can even work as a good saving throw because if you die and get wiped out, but the boss dies at the same time, or at least at the end of the turn from the burn damage, you'll still get the win because you can come back from the dead. And I know this because that's actually how I won an earlier fight in the game. Of course, even with all those plans in mind, she's still going to be really hard, with her having 5 light points at the start of the fight and 3 separate dice rolls, on top of her having a monstrous 250 HP, which is insane for this point in the game. She's the first boss fight with new music as well, so you know you're in for some shit. There's 2 major points to talk about with Queen of Hatred from the get-go, and the first is that she's more than likely your first opponent to use ranged attacks. Why does this matter? Well, normally up to this point, if 2 units ran into one another, they would clash, and likely they would do damage to one another depending on who won, with what dice rolls, and you could cut those attacks off if you had another party member closer that was able to intercept the attack. However, with the Queen of Hatred attacking from a distance, that's more or less out the window, and her attacks do additional damage if she wins, or at least if her wins are one-sided. Basically, it's kind of like Bone Crunch from Bravely Default, where the more damage you take, the more damage you take. However, the targeted party member isn't completely helpless, as a solid defensive role can mitigate the attack's damage and keep it from being one-sided, or a more aggro build can go for really big hits and essentially parry her magical girl shots with just really big, high, strong numbers. It's pretty funny. We also have her other attack to contend with, which is a close range attack where she will designate and mark a specific party member. This party member is going to be the one she'll primarily focus on her attacks on for the rest of, well, the next few turns, and she marks them as the villain of the fight. This designation lasts a few turns, and now their clashes will matter a lot, as the screen will get more and more pink or less pink depending on how the fights go, because if she loses a clash with the villain, her hysteria meter will fill up as shown in the background, becoming more and more pink. But if she wins clashes, her hysteria will decrease. If it fills up to max, let's just say bad things happen. Other party members and their battles don't seem to affect her hysteria meter, even if they intercept some of her attacks, and after a few turns the villain designation will wear off and she'll choose someone else to mark. The best strategy I found for this is to use cards like E-Endure, Cumulus Wall, and Taste My Flaming Bat. These are very defensive oriented cards that will have you technically lose the clashes most of the time with the queen, but instead of taking 20 damage from the clashes, you take like 1 to 5, and you might even get a bit of chip damage or status effects slipped against her if you get really lucky. But of course, there's another major issue to contend with in the form of Arcana Slave, as the first attack in the game you're likely to see that hits every single party member, so now screen nukes are on the table. Nice to know. But what's worse is that she always follows it up with 2 casts of In the Name of Justice, basically hitting everyone with a flamethrower, only to pull out a machine gun while you're still burning. Good luck. So how in the ever-loving fuck do we win? Well, obviously, save the fight for later. There's plenty of strategies using later game cards and job classes that can take this boss down in 2 turns. But maybe you're stubborn like I am. And maybe you chose to fight and kill Namielle before even reaching Tarquan in Monster Hunter Stories 3. Well, here's some things to keep in mind. If you have really large Unga Bunga attacks like Heavy Peaks or Transpierce when she's trying to gun you down with her multi-hit attacks, like Name of Justice, you can pretty easily parry those bullets, rush up, and smack her in the face for quite a bit of damage. Sure, this can be risky when performed by a marked character, but if she's just spamming wildly or if you're intercepting an attack, this can help out a ton. Additionally, defensive skills are great, but the best of them is probably Cumulus Wall, as it can give large enough defenses that even if you lose the clash, you still take like 1 damage. And then you can even strike back with an attack that inflicts bleed. Taste My Flaming Bat does much the same, but it's not quite as strong defensively, though it will still get the burn in, which is pretty nice. It's also important to know that just because you have 2 dice rolls available, doesn't mean you need to do a double attack every turn. Even if you're being conservative with your light points, you don't want to just spam 1 and 0 cards with Reckless Abandon because you want to keep your options open for her scarier turns. Most importantly to me though is Arcana Slave. It looks scary, and it's the first screen nuke in the game, so you'd think you need to dedicate everything to stopping its damage. No, ignore it. If you can mitigate it a bit of the damage, that's a nice bonus, but at worst it's a flat 13 damage that you can just eat and power through. It's her magical minigun follow-up that's far worse. But there's also one piece of esoteric knowledge that Yu-Gi-Oh players or Jujutsu Kaisen fans could never comprehend. To win, we're going to need to read. You can easily check her dice and see exactly what attack she's doing, exactly what her turn order will be, and who she's going to target. And you can plan around this. Look at the arrows coming out of each of her attacks, and look at what defensive measures you have available. But also, not just check what party member she's attacking, look at the dice she's targeting. Use that targeted dice for your main counterplay, whether it be a defensive measure like Cumulus Wall, or a big Unga Bunga like Transpierce. Then use your 1 and 0 point cards if you can spare them to sneak in some status damage or chip damage against her. It's whatever you think will be helpful. With all this knowledge and planning, you can still die because you misclicked at an inopportune time, like a total moron. No big deal, we can always just run it back in. Ah, crap, she turned into Quetzalcoatl. Okay, so if this happens and you didn't intend to trigger this effect, just reset because you're not going to win. She gets healed back to 300 HP, and she does even more damage than before. That being said, while Arcana Slave now does way more damage in this form, it also seems to stagger her afterwards, so if you build around triggering this form, then that's not a terrible option to plan for. However, you're probably going to need things like Urban Nightmare level skills and stats to survive a lot of her attacks in this phase. I did not build around this form, however, so yeah, it's a lost cause for me. You may be surprised to hear this, but I actually didn't get tilted with this boss fight. I was learning things as I went, trying out different strategies and seeing what stuff did and didn't work, and going back to the drawing board when the need arose. I was checking her moves and countering her plays when they came up, and I was engaging with a lot of the game's combat in ways that I hadn't really done prior to this point. Sure, Arcana Slave was kind of scary at first, but really it's nothing more than a flashbang that comes before the real threat. I was sneaking in chip damage while taking your physical attacks, putting up defensive cards when necessary. What was important though is you never get cocky in this fight. One slip up could lead to a party member going down, and from there the entire fight will very quickly spiral out of control. It was important to know when to strike, when to catch my breath, and when to intercept her attacks that would target my staggered party members. Thankfully though, she doesn't seem to be completely aggro on staggered members, so it's not a complete lost cause if someone gets staggered. Having your team members work together is mandatory in this fight, and so is carefully reading her attacks and metering your aggression to make sure the hysteria gauge doesn't reach 100%. But also know that 99% hysteria is basically the same as 0% hysteria, so don't be too afraid to take a hit if you think you can get some good damage in. And if you manipulate the turn order with interceptions, you can make her marking attack come out last, since it requires that she gets close to the player that she's targeting. And sure, you may lose the clash, but if you got 30 damage in before she could give you the villain designation, then she's not allowed to get mad about it. And when her relatively weak marking attack wins her the clash, the hysteria gauge will even go down, which is pretty funny. Sneak your hits in, play it safe when necessary, and keep the bad status effects going and chip away at her, and you will come away with a victory. Your reward for victory is getting the Queen of Hatred's powers, and additionally a scene with Tippereth where she basically states, "I learned the stuff in the field and maybe a little bit more, but I don't concern myself with the extraneous bullshit," which honestly, working a full-time job in the computer sector, that's pretty relatable, especially when you're not salaried. Anyways, now I could end the video here, and I think it's gone on more than long enough, but the thing is, I actually really like the Queen of Hatred fight. It reminds me a lot of Namiel from Monster Hunter Stories 3 or Sprung from Expedition 33, of being fights that far outclass you at the point you unlock them, but also sitting there waiting for you to challenge them at basically any time you want. And while it can be very difficult, if you have careful planning and a lack of sanity, you can beat them early and get their rewards, and it can be very fun and satisfying. Heck, I've got videos on my channel dedicated to beating Sprung in Act 2 of Expedition 33 after a 30+ minute boss fight, or beating Namiel before even reaching Tarquan in Monster Hunter Stories 3 in a 40-minute long boss fight. The sensible thing is to save the fight for later because it's not going anywhere, but it's fun to pull off some random bullshit for the win. But this seems a little too positive. And don't you worry. I still have a boss that I think is almost as tough as Queen of Hatred, but I hate the fight far more, and unlike Queen of Hatred, he can't be put off until later. Of course I'm talking about Philip, what did you expect? You battle him once earlier in the game, and he's the only one in his group to survive the encounter. Then you'll battle him again alongside Oscar, who looks like he stepped right out of Bloodborne, and his two daughters, I guess? Apprentices? Whatever. Pamela and Pamela, who have a pretty interesting setup for characters' backstory, and it's too bad they'll be dead within 10 minutes, so it doesn't really matter, because we're back on the Darker Than Black bus for a little bit. Anyways, this fight isn't that hard, but Philip will escape again because this man is pulling protagonist powers out of his ass, but it's shitty Korean web novel protagonist powers, meaning absolute ass pulls and miraculously surviving while randomly killing off characters we've known for 5 minutes that the story thinks we're supposed to care about. I'll let you go ahead and guess which manhwa I'm making fun of right now. What really sucks though is his enhanced form is the first boss in the game to overtake the library floor and play his own boss music, so you know shit's getting real, but like, I feel like they went a little bit overboard here. Philip has 300 HP, far and away the most up to this point in the game. Thankfully, his health bar is a lie because he's starting the fight injured, so he only has 240 HP, and you win if you can reduce his health down to 10. So really, it's only about 230 you have to cut through. Problem is, that's easier said than done. Now, all of his attacks are melee focused, sure, but almost all of his actions are 0 cost in terms of light points, and starting out, he throws up so many defensive cards that you're often finding yourself doing 0 damage to him while he counters back and applies a fair amount of burn damage to you. And while you can wear away at his stamina, more often than not, he's going to start gaining stamina back if his defensive cards win the clashes, so good luck. The idea is that he's going to become more vulnerable when he enters his flaming form, where he no longer throws up his defenses, but he now has 5 dice rolls available, meaning he can just spam attacks, all of which not only do good damage, but light you on fire, and once he's in his fiery mode long enough, he pulls out an attack that does so much damage it's basically acting as a delete button against the unlucky schmuck it targets, and once his emotion gauge gets maxed out, which it will by the way, he gets up to 6 actions per turn. That is double the Queen of Hatred and triple anything else up to this point in the game. You want to hear some grand strategy of how I beat him? Well, that's too bad. I don't have one. I managed to win because I got lucky realization buffs and managed to barely outlast him because he's so high aggro that after a few turns he won't be able to use all his actions anymore. We're quite literally beating this jackass by decking him out and making him slowly bleed to death until the stars finally align to give us the win. Sure, Queen of Hatred is mechanically tougher and she has higher health, but her fight doesn't have a run back and is way more fun. This fight has another battle that can be pretty challenging right before it. It's a single floor battle, so you're locked into whomever you bring in for the first fight with no reinforcements allowed. Everything he does lights you on fire, and he can either stall you to death with you burning up, or erase your party members before you can even say beginning after the end has animation that rivals One Punch Man Season 3. And unlike Queen of Hatred, this fight is completely mandatory to complete here and now in order to advance the story, so it hard stops you. Fuck Philip, I hate that he escapes again, all these interesting characters that get introduced and die quickly, yet this shitty manhwa protagonist reject gets to keep escaping death. What a load of crap. Oh right, there was one last fight in Urban Plague. It takes us back to the warp train. I wonder what's going on there. What the hell is that? I know this world uses the warp for fast travel, but I didn't think it meant the one from Warhammer 40k. Okay, actually I'm gonna just break character for a bit here. Originally I had kind of planned to end the video at, that little joke bit, but honestly I kind of want to talk about this whole warp train / Lovetown segment because I really like it. I beat the fight on my first try due to a glitch where Wayne Karibo gained 9,999 HP mid-fight. Be careful when using the workshop, it can kind of screw with things. However, you may be surprised to hear I've got some massive praises to sing for this part of the game. The main things you have to watch out for are Tamari has very high HP for this point in the game, and they're actually able to revive the mooks to half health if you die and swap over to a second floor. But at least we actually get a second floor for this boss fight, unlike Philip. Ugh. Anyways, this was the part of the main story that really gripped me. People are trapped in a box in space and effectively stuck in this moment in time. They can't age, they don't get hungry or tired, and any health issues that they currently have going on when they enter the train will persist, such as Olga's hangover. Now, if this was an hour or 12, that would suck, sure. But simply put, it took 13 days, 90 days, 10 years. They were trapped here for over 2,000 years. Being trapped, unable to go anywhere while your body is basically trapped in time, after a while your sanity would wane away, and the people on the train aren't even able to take their own lives in order to escape it. Actually, trying to do so would be worse because the pain from committing such an act would persist. But they're going to continue living in agony. Even if someone's body was crushed down into the smallest bits of biomass, they'd still be alive and feel everything. That's terrifying, and honestly, all we're missing is a little bit of fire, and we've got ourselves a modern interpretation of biblical hell. And after 10 years, we get this crazy flesh golem to act as a way to survive, resulting in Tamari, which was a young couple pushed to the brink. Basically, no one feels good about this fight. Even Angela, who's normally neutral on the whole matter, hates this because a primary rule of the library is that individuals accept the invitation and come here of their own volition. If they die in the process, well, they knew the risks, so be it. Tamari doesn't fall into this category because after 2,000 years of having their body merged together and stuck in this place trapped in time, they've been broken and reduced to a child, not even able to remember who they once were, and are tricked into signing the invitation to be a sacrificial pawn, and even Angela knows this. Unfortunately though, the individuals Tommy and Mary are long since gone, so our only real choice here is mercy killing. Again, the fight honestly isn't that hard even if you don't have a character become practically invincible. I went back with the team and fought him again, and I won first try without getting the glitch, so yeah, it's not too bad. But it's probably the most invested the main plot had gotten me up to this point in the game. I wanted to see where things were going, and while I'm here, I guess I'll talk about the music. Tamari isn't the first boss to have unique music, as the Queen of Hatred and Philip also get unique battle themes, but this is the first boss to have a Millie song play outside of, the opening, but that's not a boss fight, so I'm just rambling. Now, with a creature like this, you'd expect the music to either be some big horror sting like Resident Evil, or maybe some really sad music, but that's not the case at all. From a Place of Love is a happy and upbeat song that sounds like a girl that's excited but getting the jitters on her wedding day. Unfortunately though, this is not a regular marriage, it's a fear and hunger marriage. Something tells me the doctor got the wrong idea when he read Mark 10. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. I know the red letters mean it's the direct word of God, but it's talking about the sanctity of marriage and how it's a genuine commitment that shouldn't be ended from inconveniences and not whatever's going on with this flesh golem monstrosity. Terrifying theming, imagery, and flesh golems aside, here's the best part of it all. The train never broke down, and it didn't have some weird malfunction. The flesh monsters are new, but the 2,000 years? That's a feature, not a flaw. This is one of the few plot reveals in a video game where I was genuinely shocked by a plot twist. The game 100% has me in for the long haul. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this McMonster of a video. I know I could have just made the video focusing around Queen of Hatred before pivoting to Philip near the end, but I had a surprising amount to talk about here. Library of Ruina isn't a perfect game, and it's not one that I'm going to say is a game I think everybody would enjoy. It's got some problems. The gameplay can be fun, though, and while I don't care too much for the mini arcs of characters that have the lifespan of a mayfly, the actual librarian stories are enough to keep me interested in things, and things like the warp train was grotesque as hell and also one of the best story beats I've seen in a video game. I don't know how this video will do, as I've never really covered a game blind before. At this point, it's become less of a worst difficulty spikes and more like half of a review perspective. I don't know. Next episode's probably not going to be an RPG because I've done enough reading for a good while, and despite my most popular videos being me hamming things up and complaining about stuff, I'm not really a super negative person. A lot of this is just a bit with me hamming things up for content, but it was fun trying out a new game I might not have played if not for this series. I'm sure this video ticked off some fans, and they probably clicked off the video a while ago. Everyone else who stuck around this far though, I thank you for watching. If you want to see more content, of varying quality, consider liking, subscribing, and hyping the videos. If you want to see my other episodes of Worst Difficulty Spikes, consider giving those a look. On that note, I'll see you all next time, and until then, take care, everyone. Oh, hey, Tepworth unlocked another realization boss. I wonder what this one has. Oh, sweet Jesus game, why would you do this?